Welcome to the Kafka Guide. Today, I'm going to show you how to make the most out of this beautiful Stellaron Hunter. And I know that a lot of people have some pretty bad preconceptions of her, and I do address them in this video here. If I was to summarize that video, it would be that Kafka's weaknesses are kind of over-exaggerated, and that to be honest, she's going to be fine. Hi. I'm Lace. Let's talk about Kafka. Kafka is a lightning type character walking the path of nihility. Her role at this point in the game, however, is that of a main DPS, although one day she could actually transition into becoming an offensive support. And the TLDR of her entire kit is that she applies shocks, she detonates all dots, and you just hypercarry her. Don't question it, just do it. Just run the Bronya, run the Asters, etc. When it comes down to it, she is actually extremely self-sufficient, and you guys will see why when we explore her kit. And so at this point in the game, there is only one other character I can compare against Kafka, and that is Sampo, because they're both kind of like dot-based characters. As you can see, Kafka is getting the premium treatment because she is a 5-star unit. Alright, let's quickly walk through her kit. Her basic attack is super vanilla. It's just lightning damage and it scales off of attack. For her skill, Caressing Moonlight, she deals damage to 3 targets in which the middle one takes the most damage and the adjacent ones take less damage. This component of her skill can actually crit. What you'll also notice is that enemies will have teardrop icons and a web icon. The teardrop indicates the enemies that do have dots to detonate, and the web indicates the target enemy that you are going to actually detonate. What that means is that you can only detonate one enemy at a time with the skill. And so when the second component of the skill activates, if the enemy has any dots, then it immediately forces a tick of those dots without consuming it. And this part cannot crit. For her ultimate, we have Twilight Trill, and this is also in multiple phases. She first deals lightning damage to all enemies, this component can crit, and then she applies a big shock to all enemies, and I call it a big shock because the multiplier is at 290%. In comparison, at the same level, Serval's is 104, which is 3 times less. And this shock lasts for 2 turns. Now, if the enemy has shock, which it will because we have shocked it immediately before, then immediately force a tick of shock without consuming it. This part again cannot crit. However, with her A2 trace, Torture, her ultimate changes the shocks to all dots, so it interacts the same way as the skill does. It again detonates all dots. And so the fact that the ultimate and the skill detonates all dots is the reason why lots of people have come to the conclusion that we should stack dots to detonate them and run those dot units. And to be honest, they're not wrong. It's just not the only way to play. For her talent, when an ally basic attacks an enemy attack, Kafka will launch a follow-up attack which does lightning damage, which again can crit, but it also applies the dot equivalent to the one that is applied by her ultimate, the Big Shock. There are 2 other traces that we haven't talked about yet, the first of which is Plunder. This one allows her to regenerate energy when an enemy is defeated while shocked. And the second one, Thorns, essentially gives her extra effect hit rate on her ultimate, technique, and talent. Keep this in mind because this is super important. And lastly, for her technique, she does big AoE damage to all enemies and applies again that same ultimate Big Shock. In terms of skill priority, it's going to be the ultimate and then the skill and then the basic attack. And honestly, you could theoretically leave the basic attack at 1. Hopefully, you'll never be using the basic attack on Kafka like ever. Alright, so before we move on, let me do a quick kit analysis of what all of this actually means. The most important thing to note is that she is completely self-sufficient. She doesn't need support, she doesn't need Luca, she doesn't actually need dots, and that they are simply options. And the reason for this is because she can apply her own Big Shock, whether it's via the ultimate or the talent. She can actually sustain it and she can detonate it all by herself. The downside to that is that the ultimate, the talent, and the technique, the big shock that comes from these skills, they're actually all the same shock. And so what that means is that you aren't going to be able to stack them and they refresh each other. However, this makes it super easy to keep the shock applied to the enemies, especially in a boss setting. And the smart thing to do, especially in an AoE setting, is to use the talent to maintain those stacks on multiple enemies. That's going to maximize her damage. And so there's one other part of her kit that is super important, and that is going to be the Thorns at A6, as well as the total trace effect hit rate that you get from the minor traces. With these 2 factors in mind, you don't really need any more effect hit rates. So what it means is that you focus on the offensive stats, your attack and your speed, especially when the base shock chance of Kafka's skills are at 100%. Your boy Sampo needs effect hit rate because bro only has a 65% chance of landing his dot. What that means is that he is going to have to sacrifice offensive stats to make sure that they land, and Kafka, on the other hand, does not have this problem. Next, let's talk about stat priority and gear. And you heard me say it just before, speed is equal to attack percent, and that is all over effect hit rate. Honestly, it's more like that. It's significantly over effect hit rate. You just really don't need it at all. This is the most obvious build because all of her abilities, no matter whether it's direct damage or dot, scales off of attack. And speed, we definitely want because her moving more means she's getting more detonations off with her skill. In terms of gear, the 4-piece lightning set is actually fantastic because it buffs attack, but another alternative would be a 2-piece lightning and a 2-piece messenger, which gives you speed and attack. In terms of the trinkets, however, there is a definitive winner above all of them, and that is the Space Sealing Station set. For the body, we're looking for attack percentage main stat, which is a shame because it means we can't reuse some of like the erudition or hunt type pieces, which are generally going to be like crit rate or crit damage. For your booties, we're going to go fast like Sonic, Orbi, lightning damage, and rope attack percentage. All pretty straightforward. That was all pretty standard. Let's talk a little bit more about like the fun stuff, the alternative builds. What if we went crit on Kafka, like this one over here? Now, I'm not saying full commit, but I'm saying like kinda commit, right? Maybe you use the crit rate, crit damage headpiece and gloves from your Jingyuan or something. Maybe you take his orb, his boots, and his rope, and they have a whole bunch of crit on it. All I can say to that is that it works. Now, between crit rate and crit damage, I would certainly prioritize crit rate because it has a larger impact. And to be honest, the reason why this is viable is because it is such a pain to get attack and speed combination, and like only those two. And there was a reason why I was emphasizing there were critable components in each part of these skills. Crit, crit, crit. And so therefore, I would say that the stat priorities, if you want to go down this route, would be speed is equal to attack percentage over crit rate, over crit damage, over survival, over effect hit rate. Kafka just really doesn't need that much effect hit rate, and that's the reality of it. I am not saying that you should go a crit rate chest, but what I am saying is that if you do have a couple of these like little crit stats, just consider it a little bit of a bonus. She is a main DPS after all. And so the other fun alternative build could be ERR, energy regen rate, on your rope. Now this one is going to be a little bit more contentious because it sacrifices attack for it, which is massive, but it gives you more ultimates and therefore more detonations. Next, light cones. As always, the signature light cone is going to be fantastic. Surprise, surprise. However, in this instance, and in comparison to some of the other options, it doesn't seem like giga cracked the way that Jingyuan's and potentially Blade's was. And so this thing gives 24% unconditional damage, about 15% speed, and applies erode on attack, which is essentially another shock that will stack with your own shock. Regardless, coming over to the other light cones, and when I look at Good Night Sleep Well, this thing at max gives 24% damage, stacking up to 3 times, scaling with enemy debuffs, which means it's a total of 72% extra damage. Now, I'm not sure that 15% speed and the erode thing is going to be better than an extra 48% final damage multiplier. What I'm saying is that Good Night Sleep Well at S5 might actually be better than the signature light cone at S1. However, I think this is just a case of Good Night Sleep Well being extremely strong rather than the signature one being really bad. As for In the Name of the World, this one is kind of okay, but has some wasted stats, especially on Kafka. It gives 24% damage, and the skills effect hit rate and attack scaling increases by 18% and 24% respectively. The effect hit rate component is completely wasted on Kafka's skill, and you're probably better off using this bad boy on like your Sampo, who again is coping with the 65% dot landing rate. In a similar vein, Eyes of the Prey is also really decent because it's pretty straightforward, extra effect hit rate and extra dot damage for all of your skills. And the last one that's kind of worth mentioning is Fermata, and this bad boy actually gives you at max, because this one is the one that you can buy from the shop, 32% break effect, but also a conditional 32% damage multiplier, which is pretty much always going to be on. Alright, team comps, and this is probably going to be the most important section, especially if you did watch the video that I talked about at the start. The reality is that Kafka can play as a hyper carry. You don't need Sampo, you don't need Luca. You can certainly run them, but again, they are just options. They just bring something a little bit different to the table. Sampo gives an extra dot for detonation, and as far as I know in the game, his dot is the next strongest after Kafka's, but Luca's might be a good contender. He has fantastic windbreak in both single target and AoE settings, and he provides a dot damage debuff on the enemy. Luca, on the other hand, applies bleed, which is probably one of, if not like the best dot in the game, because it scales off of max HP, but on top of that, he increases the target's damage received. Now, this is a universal debuff, and it's not restricted like Sampos. The other ones I'm not going to cover because they've been in the game for so long, but generally speaking, we're looking for damage, we're looking for attack, we're looking for speed, and we're looking for defense down. And so what I'm saying with all of this is that they are all options for the offensive support slots. If Kafka is the Hypercarry over here, then you can run your Bronya as the first offensive support and the Sampo. Maybe you're fighting a wind weak boss. And honestly, the elemental coverage of all of these supports for Kafka is actually incredibly wide. I think these characters actually cover every single weakness, and even if you couldn't, remember we have the Silver Wolf for the implant. Okay, and so with that out of the way, why are there 4 that are relegated down to the bottom right hand corner? Himiko, Serval, Hook. They have burn, they have a shock. The question that you kind of have to ask yourself is that, would you take any of these characters over any of these characters over here? I'm hoping that your answer is no, because to make these ones like more effective, you're gonna have to build attack sets on them rather than the crit rate or crit damage sets that you're probably already using. On top of that, a lot of their value is locked behind SP. And so you don't want to be competing with your Kafka for SP. And so yeah, I mean like it is viable, but in terms of feasible, a little bit less so. And the last one I wanted to cover was Yukong, and unfortunately she's just kind of in a bad spot where she only can really offer a big attack buff on her skill, nothing in her talents, nothing in her traces. Alright, and so the last topic we're going to cover today are the Eidelons. E1 Da Capo is actually pretty giga cracked because this turns her into a dot support. However, the weakness of this is that it is tied to the talent's follow-up attack, and the second weakness is the fact that it has a 100% base chance, which means that you might actually need to build some effect hit rate to make sure this lands every time. E2 Fortissimo is kind of similar to E1, except for the fact that it's always on as long as she is alive, and it has no dependency on EHR. Now, when you get to E2, you're kind of starting to think, oh, maybe I should run a dot team, and you will be correct. E4 is pretty straightforward. She essentially gets more energy, which leads to more ultimates and more detonations. And E6 is a pretty big giga juicer because it gives extra damage for the shock multiplier. So that 290, 300% shock before is increased by 156%. And on top of that, it actually extends the duration of the shock by 1 turn. Now, if you're a dolphin or a giga whale or something, I would probably stop at either the E2 or the E6. However, for everybody else, E0 works very, very well, and everything else is simply just a bonus. Honestly, I wouldn't FOMO into any of these. Like, some people may argue this is going to make her like a future-proof dot support or whatever, but I don't know, like, wouldn't you rather another 2 characters? And so that's my take on the Eidelons, and to be honest, it is going to bring us to the end of this Kafka guide. Let me know if you guys end up rolling for the Kafka, or if you did already roll for her. How many did it take? I'll probably have a pull stream, but with that, that's pretty much the end. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.